FAO InnoVentures Lab intends to be an incubator, receptor, and disseminator of out-of-the-box ideas and solutions. Paula, can you please show the agenda? Today's event will be hosted by FAO's Deputy Director-General for Programs, Beth Bechdol, and we are honored to have as our special guest speaker, Columbia University Professor Rita McGrath. After Rita's presentation, Beth and Rita will talk about how some of the concepts seen today apply to the work of the United Nations. Their dialogue will be followed by a live Q&A session where you will get to ask a question to our panelists. So please remember to post your questions using the Q&A function, and please remember to vote to help us to prioritize which questions will be answered first. The FAO InnoVentures Lab was born and is powered by the Youth Committee. So I would like to take a moment to introduce the people behind this fantastic initiative. Kazuki, Catherine, Paula, Amin, Lorenzo, Laura, Edward, Angelica, and Matt. Thank you for all your hard work and dedication. Do we have everyone on the screen, Paula, so that they can see us? Say hello.
Hello, everyone.
Okay, without much for, great. Is Kazuki with us? I see the Jan there.
Oh.
Okay, without much further ado, I am pleased to introduce Beth Bechdol, Deputy Director-General for Programs at FAO. Beth has more than 25 years of experience in working with agriculture-related issues. Before joining FAO, she was the President and CEO of the US-based AgriNovus, a catalyst for innovation in the food and agriculture industry. Beth, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gladys, and thanks to the entire Youth Committee for once again hitting a very high bar for all of us here across FAO in headquarters, in our regions, and in our country offices. Your entrepreneurial spirit and your thought leadership is so inspiring to me as one of your new colleagues here, and I'm very pleased to see that your ingenuity and especially your focus around innovation continues. For those of you who I haven't had a chance to meet yet, I am one of this organization's newest employees. I arrived on March 6th. I started my new role as the Deputy Director-General on March 9th. And about 4 days later, like all of you who are at least here in Rome and maybe even in other places, as lockdown began for many of us tied to COVID, I've been working for the past 2.5 months out of my sparsely furnished Airbnb apartment. So today's conversation around strategy, around innovation, uncertain times, I know we'll be talking about that through more of an organizational lens, but I think the topics are also incredibly relevant to us personally. And so I'm very much looking forward to Rita's presentation. Just a couple of very high level points around innovation that I think I'd like to stress with this group as I think about personally innovation as it relates to FAO. There's sort of two ways that I think going forward we really collectively need to be thinking about opportunities to innovate. The first is as it relates to the work that we do in global food and agriculture. Growing up in agriculture, growing up in farming, I would argue that it's always been one of the most entrepreneurial and most innovative and most tech-intensive kinds of sectors that exist. But today, more than ever, innovation is emerging at a pace that is unprecedented when we think about how it is delivered in food and agriculture globally, whether it's in the plant sciences, whether it's in animal health and nutrition, human nutrition and food, whether it's in fisheries or forestries or new climate-related tools, and all of that overlaid with incredible new opportunities that we have that are inspired by data and algorithms and mathematics and engineering and all the digital tools that are available today. So for us, thinking about innovation through a very holistic, very systemic way, and thinking about the strategic utilization of innovation in food and agriculture in all countries is something that I would really challenge each of us to be mindful of. The second area that innovation affects us is as it relates to what we do organizationally. Who we are as FAO, how we deliver our programs, how we deliver our mandate to get to zero hunger, to end poverty, to work on climate-related challenges. And I think more than ever, as we've all recognized, COVID-19 and other circumstances have caused each of us to think about doing our own work, our personal work, our team's work, our organization's work in more innovative ways. It's a bit hard to believe, given the number of Zoom calls that we all now navigate so nimbly on any given day, that prior to COVID-19, FAO as an organization really was lacking some of the most basic, even teleworking policies. And so when you think about how we are all forced many times, and sometimes out of crisis comes your greatest opportunity to innovate, which I think we'll talk about today, this is a tremendous opportunity for us to continue to improve as an organization. Whether that's through continued adoption of new digital tools, thinking again about our program delivery, thinking about all of the reporting lines that are involved in a very structured and very large organization like FAO, there is a huge opportunity for each and every one of you who are a part of today's conversation and listening to Rita's comments to think about how we innovate internally, how we innovate as an organization, and we do our work in even better and more efficient ways. So thanks again to the Youth Committee. I'm so excited to get a chance to meet Rita through this engagement, and I so look forward to her comments and to our conversation together and with you. Back over to you, Gladys.
Thank you so much, Beth. And thank you so much also for your leadership. It has been, this initiative has been a great opportunity to work with the Youth Committee. And thanks to the FAO leadership, we have been able also to broadcast now to the public. So that was Rita's idea, and I'm also grateful for the opportunity. So next, we have our special guest speaker, Columbia Business School Professor Rita McGrath. Rita is a best-selling author and a sought-after speaker, so we're very honored to have her with us today. Rita is one of the world's top experts on innovation and growth, and is one of the most regularly published authors in the Harvard Business Review. She is consistently ranked among the top 10 management thinkers in the world, and was ranked #1 for strategy by Thinkers 50. Rita is the author of the best-selling The End of Competitive Advantage, and her new book is Seeing Around Corners: How to Spot Inflection Points in Business Before They Happen. Rita, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I guess I should share my screen, right? Can you all see that? Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and to support the work that you do, which I think is just so critically important. So I'll speak for a few minutes just on some ideas around what strategy looks like in a period of uncertainty. And then as many questions as people would like to ask, I'd be delighted to respond to. So the most recent book that I wrote, I think, is very germane to what we're all dealing with right now, because it deals with strategic inflection points. And I define a strategic inflection point as, following on the work of Andy Grove back in the 90s, it's something that creates a 10 times change in some aspect of your organization's experience. And right now we're living in what for most of us will be the mother of all inflection points, when a pandemic has caused both the supply side of the economy and the demand side of the economy to basically collapse. And assumptions that we were making even 6 months ago are no longer valid. So the idea that we would be comfortable in the company of strangers. I mean, that's been an assumption in human history for many millennia. And now a lot of businesses, everything from hospitality to travel to the convention business to teaching, all those are being thrown up in the air if human beings aren't comfortable being together. So I think that's an example of a major inflection point. Now, the good news, as Beth alluded to earlier, is if you catch those moments in a great way, it can take your organization to new heights. If you miss them, of course, it can cause real loss. And the thing that's interesting to me about inflection points is that oftentimes when you're looking at a change in the environment through the lens of the past, you miss them or you don't respond appropriately. So just as an example, I'll take YouTube, or you could take Zoom for that matter. When they first start, these things aren't seen as particularly important. So when you think about YouTube, right? I mean, when it first began, were industry titans quaking in their boots at the idea that this technology was going to render media empires and advertising and all kinds of other things irrelevant? No, what was YouTube when it first started? It was cat videos. A lot of it still is cat videos. So I think it's hard for us sometimes when these things first begin to see the full implications. And that's what I think we're trying to make some sense of today, is really what does all this mean for us and what do we do next? So let's talk a little bit about innovation. And when I talk to organizations that are trying to become more innovative, a lot of times they get all caught up in what I call innovation theater. And innovation theater, you know what that's like, right? You put everybody on a plane, or you used to. They'd go off to Silicon Valley. They'd ride around on the Google bikes. They'd get their picture taken next to the Facebook sign, and then they'd come back and there'd be ideation boot camps and Post-it notes all over the walls and all that kind of thing. And the trouble with that is not that that's bad necessarily, but it's not complete. So the real processes of innovation involve at least three major groups of activities. And the first is indeed ideation. That's getting great ideas, basic research, looking for things internally, looking for things externally, getting input from lots of different people. But the ideas aren't going to make themselves a reality. The next thing you have to do is incubate. And what you're trying to find out there is what's the fit between whatever market you're trying to serve, so what customer group or constituent group you're trying to help, and the solution that you're offering. This is where experimentation is important, market creation. A lot of technical learning often takes place in the incubation period. And then when you've got something you think is going to work and it's ready for the marketplace, then you have a process of what I call acceleration. And you can think about this as though your main organization is like an 8-lane highway and it's driving along at 100 kilometers an hour, and your little new opportunity is just on the on-ramp, and somehow you've got to bring it to maturity. And like any adolescent, this is a difficult process, right? You have to bring in the lawyers, and all of a sudden compliance becomes important. You've got what I call technical debt and organizational debt that need to be repaid, because in the incubation phase, you're just experimenting, right? You're trying things. They're not grown up. They're not fit for complete business yet. So you somehow got to bring that little business into maturity. And that's where an awful lot of effort goes into. Sometimes the teams need to change. Sometimes the person who's the blank sheet of paper, big idea person, that's not the person that necessarily wants to grow the business or grow the organization. So I think it's very important to remember you've got to be able to develop capability in each of these three areas: ideation, incubation, and acceleration. And unless you have those three areas with talent and with the right capability, your innovation efforts are probably going to stall at some stage. So what are the kind of cultural elements of learning in high uncertainty environments? And we're referring today really to innovation, but I would say in this current COVID-19 environment, we are all now in the same high uncertainty environment that innovators traditionally have existed in forever. So it's interesting to me because I've worked in that environment for a long time and the world is kind of crashing my way. So what are some of the basic building blocks here? Well, one of the most important elements is portfolio management. So how do you think about where you're spending your precious resources, your time, your money, of course, but your capabilities, where those going? What are you spending them on? How do you get a complete view of what the portfolio looks like? You need some kind of governance and funding structure to appropriately, again, allocate resources and time. You need to be planning to learn, and that's what I call discovery-driven planning, or planning to uncover what the future holds. Failures need to be part of the experience. Good ideas and terrible ideas look nearly identical at birth, and you just don't know. And so what you need to do is plan to discover. And so you've got to be willing to have some things not work out, or you're not planning far enough. And then there are critical leadership roles that need to take place. So you need to have someone setting the broad direction. You need to have someone actually driving the new opportunities, driving the new businesses. And then very often you need someone, as I said, accelerating, knitting together the organization and the ventures in a way that's productive. So I'll let me just spend a little bit of time on the resource allocation process, because I think that's one of the most important. But bear in mind, that's just part of a whole gestalt around learning in innovative spaces. So I like to think of this in terms of portfolios of activities, where one dimension of uncertainty you're dealing with is about markets. And you can think of that as product markets, but it could also be constituents, political markets, basically external to your organization. And the other dimension is uncertainty about the technology or the capability. Will this work? Will it scale? What are the regulations around it? How does this fit into a legal framework? And different kinds of opportunities you're pursuing will have different tasks to perform for you, depending on where they fall in these dimensions of uncertainty. So the most easy to understand are what I call core enhancement opportunities. And these are just basically ways of making your core set of activities stronger and healthier. So things like Six Sigma, optimizing a process, reducing unnecessary work, making things more seamless, taking things digital. These are all innovative, very innovative, but they're, you kind of know who you're doing them for and you know how to do them. So they're very important, but they're not necessarily that uncertain. Now, moving out a level of uncertainty, you have areas that are really poised to be almost ready to be your next generation core. So you can think of them as near field, I call them positioning platforms. So an example of what I call a platform positioning option is where the uncertainty you're really trying to resolve is uncertainty about the technology. So an interesting example there is Adobe. Which was founded by selling basically shrink-wrapped, very expensive software in a box that people bought and owned. And they made a very bold transition in the early 10s to moving their entire business model to the cloud. And they changed their way that they interacted with their customers. So they went from people being able to buy their software to saying, no, we're not selling you our software anymore. You're going to have to pay a subscription price for it. So we went from getting a very high price for a concrete offer to being, a continuous flow kind of offer. And at first, customers absolutely hated it. In fact, 50,000 of them signed a change.org petition begging Adobe not to do this. But they stuck to their guns. They made the transition. And what they found when they got into the market was that previously they'd had quite a contained market because buying an Adobe product was very expensive. Once you went to the cloud and offered it as a subscription, you could reach a far broader array of people because you could offer much more affordable products. And so you can be an Adobe customer now for $7.99 a month. Or you can go all the way up to the full featured suite, which is obviously much more expensive. But the critical thing they had to figure out was, could their cloud-based offering be as good or even better than the shrink-wrapped box? And that was the challenge that their CEO set to them when they were first launching this initiative. And that was really solving a lot of very thorny technical issues. Contrasting case is what I call the platform scouting category, where what you're trying to figure out there is, what does the customer really want? So you sort of solve the technical problems. You've got something you know how to do. What you're trying to do is figure out how to sell it to people. And Amazon's Web Services is an interesting example there, because what Amazon basically did was they made a bunch of acquisitions, which brought into the company some very powerful enterprise software capability. And they built it out for themselves because they needed it for their own growing business. And then a couple of these entrepreneurs said, hang on, if we need this, maybe other companies do too. So they wrote a 2-page white paper. They brought it to Jeff Bezos, the CEO, and they said, we'd really like to explore this idea of selling what we've built to other companies. And you have to remember, at the time, Amazon was just a retailer. They were an online retailer, but they were just a retailer. This idea of selling software services was kind of heretical. And Bezos looked at the idea. He said, I think this is a great idea. Sent the 2 guys off to Florida to go figure this out. And what they were trying to figure out was product market fit, right? So this notion of, I've got this capability, would somebody buy it? And that's an example of this kind of platform scouting idea. Now, once you get into the outer rim of this portfolio map, you're now in the world of what I call options. And an option is a small investment you're making today that buys you the right, but not the obligation, to make a set of subsequent decisions. And one of the big mistakes I see organizations make when they're in the innovation area is they treat everything as though it's got to be brought through to completion. Well, no, with an option, what you're doing is you're opening up an opportunity and evaluating to see whether it might eventually turn into something. So a positioning option is a case of, I'm pretty sure there's a demand, but for whatever reason, the technology isn't quite mature enough to be offered to a target market. So I'll give you an example of something that I would love. I mean, definitely would love this. So, you all have the maps on your phone, right? And you go to a strange city, or you go somewhere where you're not familiar. And I don't know about you, but I open up the map, and even with the GP, the thing that shows you like what the buildings and everything are like, inevitably, if I'm emerging from a subway, let's say, and I'm looking to where to go, and the right direction would be to go left, I will without a doubt go right. In fact, my family has this down to an art. If mom thinks it's right is the right way, you're 95% much better off going the other way. So what I would love is as a true kind of person in my phone that would tell me, Rita, get out of the subway, make a right. When you get to the place where that big truck is parked, make a left. That kind of sort of as though someone's actually giving you directions, right? I would love that. Now, pieces of that solution already exist. So we've got the 3D imaging from Google. We've got some voice-enabled control on the map. But today, this sort of true 3D GPS guidance that would be like a person giving me directions, it just doesn't exist yet. And the reason it doesn't exist is that it requires things that haven't been invented yet, or that aren't quite there yet. So, it takes too much processing power. It takes real-time sort of sensing. It takes a more advanced determination of what's going on in the environment than I might have, than it currently exists. Now, everybody agrees that would be fantastic. Many of us would really love that. So it's not a case of the market doesn't want it. It's a case of first we have to crack the technical problem, and then we'll have to figure out if somebody's going to be willing to pay for it. But that's an example of a positioning option. Now, if your enterprise's activity depended on geolocation, you would absolutely want to be making some small investments in this area, because if somebody else figures it out and you don't, that could be a serious problem. That does not mean you want to go full force, fully fledged into positioning yourself there. So that's an example of a positioning option. You're taking out a position to learn or to protect your opportunity, but you're not making a full commitment yet. Now, different situation when you're, taking a capability that you have into some kind of new area. And what you're trying to do there in the scouting option space is you're trying to experiment in a way that allows you to answer some hypothesis. So a great example of this is an organization I work with called Varo Money. And Varo Money is a startup bank. Their target customer are income secure but cash flow challenged millennials. So these are young people with jobs, but they haven't accumulated much wealth yet. And so it's a wedding, it's a car repair, it's a security deposit on an apartment, and they're in cash flow problems. So what Varo Money's mission is to help them solve that. And the whole thing is branchless. It all runs on a cell phone. And so it's all digital. And there's a chatbot by the name of Val who's kind of looking after the customers, and the customers kind of interact with this chatbot. And so the question came up in the design process, well, what sort of personality should Val have? Interesting question, right? And very quickly, the debate broke into two camps. And one camp said, well, Val should be, millennials are so crazy, right? So Val should be like, hey, dude, tough weekend, huh? Boy, oh boy, don't worry, got your back, emoji, emoji, thumbs up. right? So very casual, very kind of, hey dude, very kind of Venmo almost. And then the other camp was horrified by this. They said, oh no, it should be Mr. Robertson, based on our AI analysis of your cash flows, this is the course of action we would recommend. So, basically 2 points of view. Hey dude, Mr. Robertson. Now the thing is, at the moment of this debate, nobody knew. There were no facts in the room. And what I find is very dysfunctional in organizations is people will form these opinions completely fact-free, and then they will defend their position as though they were right, as though they knew what was going on, when they really don't. Nobody knows. And so what we did was we said, well, we don't know. You don't know. Nobody knows. This has never been done before. So let's do an experiment. So we spent like $1,000. We got 2 interns. One intern got to be, hey dude. The other intern got to be Mr. Robertson. And they manually responded to inputs from the users on a mocked up kind of wireframe of these in this chat interface. We lured representatives of our target market into kind of a large conference room with offerings of pizza, and we let them play with the thing, right? And record their reactions as they were working, and then sort of chatted to them and talked to them and watched how they behaved. And it turned out they hated the hey dude guy. They absolutely hated him. It turns out hey dude is fine for Venmo or when you're sharing beers with a friend, but when it comes to your financial security, you need someone a little bit more trustworthy. And so it turned out to be Mr. Robertson. Now, this I think highlights a really important point about failure, which is, the hey dude guys were wrong, right? The customer base did not like hey dude, but did they fail? No, it was a reasonable enough hypothesis that we took the opportunity to go test it. And the fact that the hey dude guys weren't right didn't mean it wasn't a valid hypothesis, right? And so the question goes from, were you right, to, was it worth $1,000 to borrow money to learn which persona was more attractive to the target population? And the answer to that, of course, is of course. So it changes the whole narrative around failure and what failure and success really mean. And I think that's a very important point to take on board, which is when you're trying to be innovative, don't think of it as being right. Think of it as, what does it cost me to learn this particular piece of information? And is learning that information worth the cost? Because if it is, whether you're correct about your hypothesis or wrong about your hypothesis, it doesn't matter. You've learned something substantive. So that's scouting options. Last case of all is what I call stepping stones. And this is the highest uncertainty area of all. And the big mistake there is making a huge commitment too early to a particular version of the future, because you don't know how to do it. And no, you don't know if anybody wants it. And yet you think it's a really big opportunity. And I'd use the current global frenzy around autonomous vehicles as a case in point, which is billions, literally billions of dollars have gone into autonomous vehicles. But it's a very uncertain area, right? So the technology is the least of the problems. And I think a lot of the tech companies are sort of like, oh, well, if you strap a bunch of sensors on a Volvo and that's going to be an autonomous vehicle, you can get a car to drive itself. What we don't know is, what's the ownership regime? What's the legal regime? What's the risk regime? What's the safety regime in localities? Do we have a unified view of the rules? I mean, there's just so much unknown before these things can get to be genuinely in use that I think we can fairly safely say it's a long way off. So how do you get into those kinds of situations in a useful way? That's where you employ what I call the stepping stone strategy. And a stepping stone strategy is you find a small market or small opportunity or small situation which has a defined need that somebody's willing to pay to get resolved, and it's not being resolved well in the current regime. So in autonomous vehicles, an example of this is the military. And one of the challenges the military has is keeping the front lines supplied. So they have got a lot of trucks that have to go from wherever the supplies are to the front lines. And there's 2 troops in each truck driving them. So let's say you need 7 trucks. Well, you've got 14 people that are in harm's way. They're not being used to do anything particularly useful. They're driving trucks. It's expensive, and that's a definable cost to the military. Now, the robots aren't smart enough yet to take over that job completely, because there's things humans can do that robots can't yet. So sort of sensing the environment, figuring things out. But the robots are smart enough to play follow the leader. So what's being commercialized today is a situation where you've got 2 human beings in the lead truck, as it were, and then 6 additional trucks, basically driven by autonomous technology, following along behind. And so what you've done is you've freed up 12 people. You know, they're not in harm's way. You're allowing less expensive alternatives to take their place. And it's a confined system, you know, not in the sense of it not being unsafe or anything, but, you know, the military is not dealing with other cars or other vehicles there. They're just dealing with, you know, the hazards of the location. So that's a perfect example of what I call a stepping stone. It's a small opportunity which you're going to pursue, which has a real quantifiable need, which can eventually lead to, you know, more substantial opportunities going forward. So one of the questions that having explained this portfolio, one of the things that I think is useful to ask as a leader is, what should my portfolio look like? So this is an example of a medical device manufacturer. They make super glamorous things like incontinence treatments, and hernia, you know, treatments and that kind of thing. And I went to meet them for the first time, and the CEO kind of puts his arm around my shoulder. He says, "Darling, if you live long enough, you will need our stuff." And I'm like, "Oh, fantastic. I can hardly wait." Anyway, so his strategy is all about speed to market and customer responsiveness. And if I were to make a guess what his portfolio should look like, right? If you go back to the portfolio map, we should have a mountain of stuff in the core, a few new platforms to take us to the future, and then some options, you know, to go forward. But, you know, you wouldn't want a huge amount of other stuff. If what you're trying to accomplish is speed to market and customer responsiveness, you really want to do a lot of innovation for today kinds of activity. So we went and actually looked at his portfolio, and this is what it looked like. A mountain of new platforms, almost nothing going on in the core, and very little in the way of options. And what was interesting about this was nobody kind of in the C-suite level, the governing level of the organization, realized that this is what was happening. And what happened in this organization, and what happens in a lot of organizations, is that you have these four things that come apart. And so what had happened in this particular company was that the career structure rewarded leaders for being the leaders of the next generation platform. So if you were a hero, if you were a big important person in this company, you were Mr. Hernia Treatment, you were Mr. Heart Stent, you know, whatever. And so the incentives in the company were pushing it to do all these new platforms, when actually the strategy was suggesting it should do something else. So you've got these disconnects. Strategy, when it's done right, is pulling you into the future. Budgets, where does today's budget start? Well, it starts with last year's budget, right? And so budgets pull you backward. Then you have the project approval process, which often isn't connected to either strategy or budgets. And then you have the people process. What do people feel they're going to be rewarded for? And so I would argue, with respect to innovation, with respect to having a coherent portfolio, that's not going to happen unless you bring these things into alignment and make sure that your projects are supporting the strategy. So a couple of things in closing. Firstly, I would say when I started in strategy more than a few years ago, all the cool kids were doing industry analysis, and you know, they weren't really looking at innovation at all. And what I think is happening as competitive advantages get shorter and the pace gets faster is we're seeing strategy and innovation really coming together. And increasingly, you can't really talk about innovation without talking about digital. And so I think those three things are really merging to create a very different environment than the one that many of us have become accustomed to. So I'll offer some concluding observations. First of all, we're all now in a world where we have to make a lot of assumptions relative to knowledge that we have. The good news is a lot of the tools that we've developed for innovation actually apply to this new world. So they've been time tested. They're different, though, than the ones that we would use with business as normal. I think getting out of zombie projects, things that aren't going anywhere, is quite important now. I think strategy, more crucial than ever. As Beth said, new opportunities open up in a crisis, but I think it does mean you have to be proactive. So if you want to dig more deeply into any of these issues, I'd welcome that. I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on YouTube. I have a channel there, and apparently one has to have a YouTube channel now, so I've got one. One other cool thing that I'm doing in the midst of the pandemic is I'm doing what I call Friday Fireside Chats. So I'm inviting people that I think are just really interesting to come and share an hour with me on a Friday. And the site for looking at them is right on my blog. It's ritamcgrath.com. And you can find them all the upcoming ones. And then we've got archives of the past ones. So I think they're kind of really interesting. I get to invite people I just think are super neat and have an hour of interesting conversations. So with that all being said, let me turn it back over to my hosts and we'll over to some Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, Rita, for that really outstanding presentation. I just have to say, I love when you see on the chat screen, I'm so riveted I can't even think about asking a question right now. That's always got to be the highest compliment that you can receive as a presenter. I have maybe a couple of opening questions that maybe can spur a little bit of dialogue and hopefully give the rest of our participants a bit of time to formulate their own questions for you. And I'm sure we're all disappointed we only have about 20-25 minutes left of that time. But interestingly, as I take through maybe a personal lens, hearing so many of the sort of perspectives that you offered. Before coming to FAO, I was a part of a startup organization in the States, all focused around advancing agricultural technology. So in many ways, even though I may not consider myself an entrepreneur, I can claim that title to some degree by the formation of this organization. Over a 5-year period, we were able to bring a great coalition of industry partners, and university partners, and private sector and government all together around agricultural technology and innovation. But we were doing it really, frankly, on a shoestring. It was a budget of a couple of $1 million a year. And by the time I left as their CEO just a few months ago, we had a team of 6, nimble, never afraid to fail, and always pushing boundaries. In March, you heard where my transition came to the Food and Agriculture Organization, now a multi-billion-dollar budget and over 13,000 colleagues. And obviously an incredibly rich history dating back now to 1945. And so I'm living in very much 2 very different worlds, culturally, organizationally, size and structure, all of those things. Still sharing a very common mission, but still very different in the way that we've operated. Here at FAO, for an organization of our size, the history that we have, I would say, and I think my colleagues would agree, probably a fairly conservative culture in the way that we operate. How do we take tactical steps to actually encourage some of the ways of thinking that you've described around innovation, but maybe more specifically, because I think this is really important, the Youth Committee has talked about this a number of times in their discussions, this comfort in being ready to fail. Because that's something oftentimes culturally in very established organizations where it's often been a penalty, or it's been something that is clearly not encouraged because there are performance metrics or other things that have long been tied to success as opposed to failure. So coach us as an UN organization a little bit on how might we begin to implement some new approaches that let that kind of approach flourish here at FAO. Over to you.
So the first resource I can offer is I have a brand new Harvard Business Review article just out this month, in fact, talking about discovery-driven digital transformation, in which I argue that the right way to tackle a big digital thing is not by going at it in a huge way, but by tackling it in pieces. So you take incremental steps to get you to a larger outcome. Second resource is a wonderful book called The Fearless Organization by my dear friend and colleague, Amy Edmondson. And Amy was the original kind of scholar who discovered the concept of psychological safety and how important that is. And what you'll find is a fear of failure is almost always accompanied by what I'll call a lack of psychological safety, in which people feel if they have a divergent opinion or their point of view is different from, say, the rest of the groups, that they're going to be punished if they speak up. And this has been demonstrated in many situations to be really, really dangerous. And Amy did her original work in healthcare organizations, and what she found was a huge number of medical errors were known as they were in process of being executed. And for example, you have the doctors, the surgeons, and the nurses were in a relatively lower power position. And the nurses knew what was going on, but felt they weren't able to speak up. And so the hospitals implemented a fairly simple intervention, which is they put the low power people in charge of the surgical checklist. And so they empowered these people who normally wouldn't have the voice of authority in the power structure with a very simple psychological tool. So I think that kind of thinking, her book is called The Fearless Organization. That's really worth looking at. Let me give an example as well of a company that I think did this really well. The company's Klockner. It's a German metals manufacturing company, metals distribution company. And their CEO had a very strong vision that this company needed to go digital or it was going to die. And he could have done a lot of things. He could have brought in, Accenture or McKinsey or somebody and done a big hoo-ha. What he did was he took 2 engineers and he put them in Berlin. And he said, I want you to do something. And by the way, hugely hierarchical, bureaucratic. I mean, this is a 143-year-old German, hierarchy. So we're not talking a sort of a snazzy startup here. So we put these 2 guys in Germany and he said, I don't care what you do. I want you to do something that makes us easier to do business with. For our customers, and I don't care what it is. And so these 2 guys went to work, and the first thing they decided to do was, at the time, believe it or not, they were still getting faxes. They were still accepting orders by fax. And so what these 2 guys said, well, why don't we make an app that replaces the fax? So instead of sending us a fax, they can download our app and customers can just place their order on their phones. Now, I thought that was so interesting because as far as the customers were concerned, that looked really innovative. But as far as the company was concerned, once the order arrived, it was the same thing that they'd always been doing as if they would have gotten a fax. So it wasn't disruptive to the organization at first. And so what they then did was, the next thing they did was, well, now that we've got digital orders, why don't we automate the parts numbers so that instead of having to manually look for parts, you can go on your phone and look at where the part's stored and you can pull that. But again, minimal disruption to the activities of the organization. Now today, this is sort of 4 years in, they now have a complete online platform that's proprietary into themselves. They've also created an online platform for the entire steel industry. It's called XON, X-O-N, and it's up and running and very successful today. And I was, in fact, they're having their annual general meeting today, and I was chatting to them and they were like, this digital thing, we would have been in so much trouble had we not already been in the process of going digital by now. It would have just killed us.
Great. One other question that I wanted to pose to you, because again, thinking about this through the lens of our organization here at FAO, as I've joined, I'm so impressed by the diversity of thought leadership, the diversity of nationalities. We have just an incredible group of people with a highly diverse type of background, even in their, sort of areas of expertise. That diversity of thought, diversity of experience is just, I think, one of our greatest assets here in the organization. Talk a little bit to us about the importance of that type of diversity of thought in this entire discovery innovation process, and maybe be even a little more specific, maybe around some examples of, the input of, women, of young people, of, again, different socioeconomic, different experiences, just maybe not one in particular, but I'd be really curious to hear about how inclusion of those different points of view really contributes maybe to some of the successful outcomes, thinking about innovation that you've described.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So one of the things that I talk about in the book, Seeing Around Corners, is the importance of having diverse perspectives weighing in on decisions. Because if you've got a homogenous perspective, so let's say the range of possible outcomes is like this, and you've got a homogenous team, you're only really seeing this possible range. So one of the things we know about innovation is that in many ways, it's very much a numbers game. So your success in innovation is going to be some consequence of how many times you try things. And if you look at the most innovative companies, so take Amazon just as an example, they try lots of things, many of which don't work out. And the scale, as Jeff Bezos will tell you, the scale of their failures has to get larger as the company gets larger. So I think the first principle is, you achieve a greater range of imaginative possibilities when you have people from very different backgrounds and perspectives weighing in on decisions. So that's the first, I think, key point. The second key point is you just understand more about the world when you have people that have different experiences of the world as part of your process. It always astonishes me when I see companies where, an all-male development team is coming up with products that are designed to be sold to women, and they have absolutely no idea. One of my favorite examples of this is Procter & Gamble years ago came up with this substitute dry cleaning product called Dryel. And so the concept was you threw this thing in your dryer, you threw your clothes in, and it would clean them, right, without having to wash them, right? And they announced this thing to fantastic fanfare, and they thought this was great. And in the product, I mean, it still sells. I mean, it's used for some niche applications, but they thought this was going to completely replace the dry cleaning business. And so, of course, it was a flop. And I've often thought to myself, I bet that whole group of engineers and scientists on the design team had wives who took their stuff to the dry cleaner where it was not only cleaned, but pressed and hung and, all the rest of the actual job to be done, right? And I bet they never even thought of that. They thought of how many molecules of dirt does this thing remove? That's what they were thinking of. So I think it just, it's very easy to get the end user experience wrong if you just don't have any representatives of that end user, or if you've got a very narrow conception of what that body is like. I would also say one last thing is, I think, the importance, again, psychological safety, the ability to genuinely take advantage of diverse teams. My late colleague, Kathy Phillips, did a lot of research on this, and she did neuroscience research, and what she found was having to deal with diversity actually ignites a different part of your brain. So the kinds of experiments she would run was she would assign a complex decision-making task to two sets of teams, one which was homogenous, one which was diverse. And the thing about real life, just as a side, in real life, you never know what the right answer is, right? You only know what the outcome was, and maybe the outcome's good and maybe the outcome's bad, but you don't really know what the right answer is. But in her experiment, you could actually know what the right answer is. And so what she found was homogenous teams did worse on the task, uniformly did worse, but they felt great about it. Everybody got along. We all decided what the rules were. We just went and solved the problem. It was fantastic. It was a great experience. And yet their performance was decidedly lower than the diverse teams. And the diverse teams did much better, but they felt awful about it. It was effortful. It required, I had to actually listen to that person and try to figure out where they were coming from. And it was hard work. And I my brain hurt, And so what diversity does when it's managed properly is actually requires more effort, and it brings more intellect into the discussions than if you're all just the same and you all just know what the ground rules are and you don't have to think about it. So it brings a better preparation for making hard decisions into the conversation.
That's great. Well, I'm still one of those that was really hoping that dry cleaning product would work, because my dry cleaning budget tends to be way more than it should be most months. So I appreciate it. If you have
a robot that would do the whole thing, then yeah, sure.
Right. That's right.
That would be fine.
Gladys, let me go ahead and turn it back over to you so you can manage the last several minutes with some of our questions from the audience. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Rita, for that. And thank you, Beth, for the dialogue. We have a lot of questions coming in from our audience. We have questions from the private sector. I see a question from Enel Green Power, Rogero Arico. I see also one from Unilever, John Joe. He was actually part of the cohort at Columbia University. And we also have some questions from academia. But because this is a democratic process, we're going to go with voting. And the first question, or at least the question that has got the most votes, is from Ed Bogart at FAO. He says, great presentation, Rita. One question, culture. How do you get a traditionally conservative culture to embrace failure? Do you have any examples of organizations who have made that shift?
Well, the Klockner example I alluded to, I think, is very useful. Now, what I do think is important is one of the mistakes I see people making is they veer toward either the mothership, the traditional business, or the new business, right? And there's this tendency to say, if you want to become entrepreneurial, it's all about the new business and the shiny objects, and those people are wonderful, and the old business is just old news. Or in a very traditional culture, it's often we're the ones that have the answer, we know how to do things. Those new people are just call us when you've got something meaningful to talk about, right? And what you want is to create a balance between the two. So one of the things they did at Klockner that I thought was so powerful was they created very intentional sharing structures between the new digital businesses and the existing skilled businesses. And what the CEO said, and I thought this was brilliant, he said, look, yes, we need the digital. Of course we need that. That's the future. But what is going to be our future competitive advantage is the deep engineering and scientific knowledge that people who've worked in our company for decades have accumulated over years. Because in the future, the materials are going to be a commodity, and it's going to be the services and the deep understanding of what our customers might be able to do, and that deep ability to invent new ways of meeting those needs that's going to be our advantage. So he set up very deliberate sharing structures between the two. So as an example, if you worked in Duisburg, which was their headquarters, you could take a secondment to Berlin and work with the digital people. The same thing in reverse, and completely free online courses, which you could take on company time, and. So a lot of work to bring those two sides together. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing I think that's important is to realize that cultures have different drivers. And a great reference there is a book by the Schneiders called The Re-Engineering Alternative. And they talk about different cultural drivers. And so some cultures are all about creation. So most startups, right? It's live the dream. Some cultures are all collective, and it's all, live for the team. Some cultures are all about individual, excellence. And that's all about, beat the competition. And some cultures are all about the plan, right? Like, let's do the plan. And I think it's important to understand where you're starting from as a culture, to understand what levers you have to kind of move it in a different direction, because each of those cultures is motivated by something different.
Thank you so much, Rita. We have another question from FAO. It's from Amin Emadi. He's also grateful for the presentation and says, as Beth mentioned, FAO has been forced into transforming their communications and working style for the unprecedented pandemic. How should the administration communicate with their staff and manage this transformation, given the gap between fast-paced growing digitalization and conservative strategies that do not comply with the new ways of working?
Very powerful. One of the cool things about the pandemic, and if there can be a cool thing about a pandemic, is, if I'd asked you 6 months ago, would you be pioneering everybody being digitally enabled and able to do their work productively whenever and wherever they wanted to? The general attitude I would have gotten would be, we'll get to that. Value. Good, absolutely great idea, but not at the top of the list. Well, in a couple of short months, it shot to the top of everybody's list. And so I think it's a great accelerator. And what I think you want to be doing is sort of really thinking about what works and what doesn't. I don't think you can over communicate in a crisis. I think the more and varied and consistent the communication is, the better. And I think being willing to be sort of more fine-grained about what we're going to keep and what we're not going to keep once we get to the other side of whatever this is. I think you're going to find a lot of your people are loving it, in terms of the autonomy, the flexibility, the willingness to be able to try new things, one of the things I think is fantastic about this is we're all able to connect very intimately with people that we in a previous time never would. So I think kind of being open-minded to where that might be good, and then also realistic about where doesn't it work. I mean, there are times when you really do need everybody virtually or in person in the same room on the same page. We need to forge an understanding. And let's be honest, you guys, many of your operations are very high risk. If you get it wrong, diseases will spread, or people will be impoverished, or something really unpleasant will happen. So you need to operate with a safety culture, and I think you need to respect that. But given that's the core kind of part of the mission, there are innovative ways you can sort of work together around that mission, as long as that's understood. One great resource I can recommend is a fabulous PowerPoint deck, of all things, that was put together by a woman named Patty McCord, who was the original HR director of Netflix. And she was tasked with deciding what the Netflix culture should be. And it's one of the best things on culture I've ever read. So if you just look up Patty McCord culture deck, you'll find it. And what she talks about is, if you give people context, So you tell them, they're clear on the strategy, they know the goals, they know the metrics, they understand the perspective. Then you can free them up to operate with enormous autonomy. But you have to do the hard job of giving them the context first. Oh, she's also got a great book called Powerful, which I can recommend. It sort of elaborates on the PowerPoint.
Thank you, Rita. We have a lot of questions coming in from the audience, and there is a question from University of Exeter that is very much related to another question from FAO again, and they're all questions about culture and traditional organizations. So I think that we have covered that extensively now. I would like to then proceed with a question from Ruggiero Arico, Enel Green Power. I don't know, Rita, if you're familiar, but this is one of the, okay, you're familiar with it. He says, different sectors are responding differently to innovation. I work in the renewable energy sector, where innovation is becoming more and more crucial. Nowadays, in many emerging countries, the trilemma, energy, food, and water, is critical. Do you agree that innovation is the only way to solve this trilemma? And do you think that the future of innovation will be necessarily linked to sustainability?
I absolutely do. And the, you know, sorry, lots of things to be said there. Great resource on this is a brand new book by my dear friend Rebecca Henderson. It's called Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. And what I would say is, yes, innovation absolutely is going to be the only way you're going to resolve this, but it's also innovation in how capitalism is designed. And the reason, and for those of you that work in the NGO sector will be very keenly aware of this, is capitalism responds to pricing signals. I mean, that's one of the things that's genius about it, but it's also one of the things that's terrible about it. And right now, prices do not reflect impact. So if I were to take Rebecca's example, would be if I bought enough coal to power my computer for a couple of hours, maybe that cost 5 cents. But then if I turn to my colleagues in public health, they say, what's the health impact across the world of burning coal? They would say it's probably another 5 cents. And then if I turn to my friends in the sustainability world and say, what's the ecological impact of that amount of coal? That's another 5 cents. So we have mispriced. We've got the fancy word economists use is we have these externalities, which are not built into the pricing structure. And I think you need both innovation in a technological sense, but we really need innovation in a societal sort of design of capitalism sense to start building some of those externalities into the way that we price products. Because capitalism without a pricing structure doesn't work.
Thank you again, Rita. We have a question from Julian Bellemore. She says, thanks, Rita, for this insightful presentation. Change can be a very difficult thing to accept for people who are comfortable with the status quo in large organizations. She's asking for some examples. I do believe that you have given plenty of examples of how to address these issues. Then we also have a question from another member of the audience. They are asking if the references that you're making to books can be shared later on. So we would like to ask you if that's possible later on, so that when we share the link to the recording of the presentation, maybe we can also share those references with the audience, as well as the names, the full names and the links to your books. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. It's 4 o'clock already, so I know that some people have to rush to other meetings. I would like to emphasize that our aim is to make these sessions tailored to your needs and interests. And so before you leave, I would like to ask everyone to take a couple of minutes of their time to answer some questions that have been prepared by the Youth Committee, so that we can improve these sessions and we can really address your interests. I would like to thank again Rita for being with us today. Thank you so much, Beth, for hosting the session. And maybe you don't know this, but I think that the Youth Committee has plans for you in the future. So, so thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you at the next FAO InnoVentures Lab. Thank you. The link is right there. You can please go and answer the survey. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Rita.
Thanks. Bye.